Good morning, everyone. Good evening, if from wherever whichever part of the world you're joining from, and welcome to another session of season 2 of Dissecting Capitalism, its past, present, and future. Today, we are very privileged to have Professor Barbara Harris-White with us, who doesn't need a lot of introduction among us young scholars working on India. And you must know, Barbara Harris-White is an Emeritus Professor of Development Studies, Emeritus Fellow of Wolfson College of Oxford University, and also a visiting professor at JNU. And since 1969, when she drove from Cambridge to New Delhi, she has studied several aspects of Indian economy through her fieldwork on agriculture, its markets, on many dimensions of deprivations on small town India, and laterally on the economy as a waste producing system on the state. I know she has widely published, and her latest books and specializations include The Middle India and Urban Rural Development, 4 Decades of Change, The Wild East, Criminal Political Economies in South Asia, and Rethinking Markets in Modern India. So she is very popular among students. She has supervised around 40 PhDs and 40 postdocs, directed Oxford's Queen Elizabeth House, and was founder director of Oxford's Contemporary South Asia Studies program. Restricted during the COVID years, she has been active in Teachers Against the Climate Crisis, a group of university teachers working out of Delhi. So a very warm welcome to Professor Barbara Harris-White to our webinar series. And Professor Barbara Harris-White will be speaking for the first 45 minutes, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Arun. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me clearly?
Very clear.
That's a great relief. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Arun, for the introduction, which is quite hard to live up to. I'm speaking from deep France, where agriculture is capitalized, where farmers are not peasants, where society has been depopulated and the land reforested in many places, and labor is supplied by migrants from Eastern Europe and sometimes even from as far away as Mali. Today I want to talk about the character of capitalism. Now, may I share my screen? Okay, can you see the title page?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So the idea is to talk about the character of capitalism from fieldwork, and it's an enormous topic. I want, by way of introduction, to talk very briefly about how I understand capitalism, so that we're all on the same page, or at least you know what page I'm on, and why I want to look at efficiency in particular from the field this evening. So capitalism is a system characterized by private property, ownership of tangible assets like land or like cold stores for potatoes, and intangible assets like stocks and like bonds. And these assets are protected either by law or by law-like authority. And the major class contradiction is between capital and labor. Labor is more or less free to sell itself. There are huge debates surrounding the concept of freedom. And labor is exploited for surplus value. And I'm going to call that profit, because that's the concept that people understand in the field. But this process involves a wide variety of forms, and possibly also of stages or forms that coexist. I'm thinking of primitive or primary accumulation, differentiation, accumulation through productive reinvestment. It's called expanded reproduction by some. It takes the form of concentration of capital, of centralization of capital. And at the same time, another process is going on, as well as concentration and centralization, and that is commodification, the turning of everything into commodities, which some economists understand as generalized markets. Now, Marx modeled capitalism from history. Neoclassical economists have markets as competitive markets as very central, and markets are, as it were, pure phenomena. I don't know how I'm going to change my slides, actually. Hang on.
It's not moving, actually.
No, it's not moving. I don't know how to make it move.
Okay,
I
maybe-
don't
Press
have
the
many.
arrow button.
Okay, so sometimes it happens. So in this case, just escape from full screen, and like the small ones you can change. So that
Okay, I
would be-
can't escape from full screen.
Okay.
Oh. I wanted to talk to this set of images of my India, the India
Okay.
where I do fieldwork. I don't know how that happened. We'll see later on whether I can move these slides. I was talking about the ways in which capitalism is modeled and talking about neoclassical economics and markets as pure forms. And for a scholar like Polanyi, pure exchange was a contradiction in terms it was destructive and dehumanizing. And tonight I want to try to humanize capitalism by looking at one of the three roles that are performed in the rural economy by markets. One of those roles is extraction between one sector and another. Typically, there's a big literature on agriculture and the terms of trade. I'm not going to look at that. The second is exploitation of labor, and possibly through petty commodity production. I'm not going to look at that. I'm going to look at the role of efficiency. Now, efficiency may be unexpected for you as political economists and heterodox economists, but it indicates competence as well as the possibility of competitiveness. And since we are stuck with capitalism and its various forms, I want to take efficiency and competence seriously. In this talk, there will be two parts. The first part is based on my own fieldwork. It's not any old fieldwork, but it's fieldwork in the kinds of markets and the kinds of capitalism that you see here. Now I'm going to try to change the slide. Yes, good. And the left is not in wonderful focus, but what you take away from it is the complexity of it. So it's not any old field, but it's rural markets. And in the part one, I'm going to make some general statements based on many years of doing field work in agricultural and rural markets in northern Tamil Nadu from 1973 to 2013, on and off, in Coimbatore district in 1980, and in West Bengal between 1981 and 2004. And I know that's a long time ago for many of you, but it's up to you to bring this kind of work up to date. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to be talking about fieldwork on markets by anthropologists rather than economists, and also archival work on markets by historians. And this work has culminated in the book that Arun mentioned called Rethinking Markets in Modern India, which was published in 2021. So the first part of my talk will be about economics, and the second part of my talk will be about non-economics. Now, this talk is raw, it is initial, and it's tentative. The PowerPoint is lamentably rudimentary, and it just consists of prompts. And I'm really giving this talk for discussion. I may not be able to answer the questions you ask, but I should be very grateful to you for having asked them. Okay, so here goes with efficiency. When I was a young scholar, the new economic thinking then privileged the analysis of prices in order to draw inferences about the efficiency of markets. And there was a huge pressure to hype the efficiency of markets, because in the 60s and 70s, we already had a neoliberal aid establishment which felt that the state didn't need to intervene if markets could be shown to be efficient. So there was a question, are they efficient? And there was a means, do it through prices. And if you look at the work of Theo Palaskas, you will see reviews of literatures, which I'm not going to cover in this talk, on the many ways in which prices have been analyzed through regression analysis and through correlation analysis. But the take-home point is that we can't make inferences about competition from prices alone. It's a flawed methodology. It's a flawed answer to the question, because we don't know about costs, we don't know about seasonal changes in flows. We don't know about changing price bases. And prices themselves are not God-given data. They are also quite flawed. So early on in my young career, I came across a conclusion after an exhaustive analysis of ways of analyzing efficiency by Bateman and Coleman, to the effect that nothing but the accounts of firms are adequate for the analysis of efficiency. Now, the accounts of firms provide evidence that rates of return are converging and that markets are therefore competitive. And you could say that the capitalists in those markets are quite competent, because if they weren't competent, they wouldn't be there. And we can use accounts to evaluate value added or the rate of return in one sector vis-a-vis, relatively, comparatively, with other sectors where capital can compete. And the stakes of this analysis used to be, and I think still are, quite high, because the middleman, the trader, the intermediary has always been demonized. We see this from the 19th century onwards. And the policy question is, does the state intervene if middlemen are not efficient? So the question for a field researcher like myself is how to study business accounts in the field in India. And I'm going to talk about that in the rest of the first part of my discussion this evening. I'm not going to talk about corporate capital, private or public corporations. I'm not going to talk about cooperatives either. And I'm also not going to talk about real accounts, because we're never allowed to see real accounts. Businessmen are reputed to be sly and difficult to interview. In my field life in India, I think I've interviewed over 2,000, if you count traders in periodic marketplaces. But they are considered to be difficult subjects to interview, far more difficult than farmers, for instance, for very good reasons. Firstly, they don't want to tell you their business in order to evade tax. The outsider is equated with somebody from the state. They want to evade surveillance as well. There's also an issue of the moral presentation of themselves to strangers. But the third factor, which might explain why you're sly as a trader presented with an interviewer who wants to ask you about your accounts, is that the interviewer's concepts and your concepts may not match. The interviewer's concepts may be unfamiliar. And I want to spend this part of my talk on some problems of familiarity, conceptual problems, as we try to gather information about efficiency and competence from fieldwork. So first, find your firm. A variety of forms of firm persist and coexist in a given marketplace, in a given region or town or rural area. This is something, a very robust finding, that firms are very varied in how they're organized. There can be nuclear firms, there can be joint firms, and there are a variety of forms of firms with more or less sleeping partners. And the partners may be family members or they may be completely different. To make things even more complicated, what we find are combinations of organization, of firm, farm, and family, so that one can't infer that because, say, a firm was a nuclear firm organized by one person, that they necessarily come from a nuclear family, or that their farm is organized by them alone. So one may have combinations. So it's very ill-advised to make inferences about the social characteristics of the family behind a given firm. And there's no determinist relationship either between a firm and its organization and the technology in that firm. And what one discovers all the time, very resilient and robust result in fieldwork in India, is that within a given sector, a variety of technologies coexist, so that the law of one technology does not hold, like the law of one organization. It doesn't hold. It's an empirical question and it requires fieldwork to answer it. the firms in the markets of a region may be quite strikingly stratified by size, or stratified by caste. There may be a dominant business caste and then other castes with other sizes of firms. But there's no determinist relationship between the strata and the functionality, the activities of a firm. In a very crude way, we can divide firms between petty capital, petty commodity production, petty trade, petty finance, and family business. And I want to offer some reflections on these two stylized forms, knowing full well that these are models and many firms don't actually fit either of these characterizations. Petty commodity production, petty capital, is often not recorded in official records, any kind of official records, even escaping the economic census. These firms may be technically illegal, or they may simply be under the threshold for registration. Scholars have called them many names. People talk about subsistence trade, or distress commerce, or street trade, or itinerant trade. Some very distinguished scholars of capitalism think of them as non-capitalist. And Kalyan Sanyal, we know, called it all the needs economy. But when these firms depend on markets for inputs and products, I think we have to take them seriously as part of capital. The debate is then whether they're autonomous or whether they're disguised wage labor. And they will be disguised wage labor when they're tied to capital for things like information, for credit, for contracts, for transport. So they'll be indebted to others for it, either in financial terms, rupee terms, or in other terms, in kind. But they continue to reproduce and even to expand. So we have a contradiction that disguised wage labor exists, certainly. It may not be transient, however. It may not be on a trajectory to be true wage labor. But a lot of petty capital, and this is where I have a debate with a lot of Marxists, a lot of that petty capital is autonomous. Very small firms don't like to get in debt. There's a moral loading in favor of independence and freedom to bargain and the security of not being dependent on others. At the same time, some of these firms are part-time, some of them are seasonal, and some of them are part of multiple occupations, including wage labor. So we have to get our minds around the fact that the economic unit of a petty firm may not be the petty firm, but it may be the household. In fact, in agriculture itself, for a whole century, self-employment in petty farms has been considered to be unviable. And yet, this unviable unit has reproduced throughout the 20th century. It's part of a unit which is much more than petty capital. It may be petty capital of several family members, it may be petty capital with wage work. And we see this sector not diminishing in India, but expanding. And so there must be ways in which it doesn't just tick over, but a social surplus is created in which petty capital expands by multiplication. It can do this at inheritance, and it certainly does this at marriage. So this is one thorny category. The family business is another thorny category. So this will be a joint household or a nuclear household. And that's an empirical question. You can't make any inference in advance. Within the family, tasks are divided by age, by gender, and by status, often by educational status. And individual family members are rewarded according to the work they do and the status they have within the household. And I mention this obvious fact because very often family labor is imputed at some notion of the wage. But we do that at our peril because almost always a family business makes a loss if its labor is imputed at the wage. So the reward is an empirical question. And I'm afraid that question has rarely been answered in fieldwork. There's a huge research project there to do. women subsidize the work of the male family labor force through their unpaid work, and also the kind productive work that they do, sometimes allocated to wage labor in terms of food. But the fact of women's work inside a family business draws our attention to kinship, which is hugely important for the transfer of capital. So a family business may well expand in a classical way through accumulation, but it may also expand through multiplication of units, or both. So what we conclude from thinking about the firm from field experience is that it's a slippery empirical problem. And I haven't said anything about the fact that registers of firms from regulated markets or from commercial taxes or GST now, or from the lists of private corporates that use these firms as agents, they are always flawed. I won't go into the problems that poses, because I'm not really trying to make generalizations, but just indicate the enormous problems of economic fieldwork. The next thing I want to talk about is the activities of a firm. This may seem to be a bit stupid question to raise. What on earth does a firm do? But when you ask that question, you get very fascinating answers and quite threatening to a kind of production function approach to the analysis of firms. Firms may be engaged in the transfer of property rights when I buy, when I sell, when I broker. They may be engaged in physical activity, processing, storage, transport, and production. They may be engaged in finance, financing production and financing trade. If one actually adds them up, there are 9 activities that a business, I'm thinking of rural, small town businesses, but I think this is also true of metropolitan businesses and businesses not in the rural sector at all. The maximum number of combinations of activities is factorial 9, which is a huge number, which I've forgotten. But in a sample of 149 firms, where I asked this question in 1980, it reduced to 51 combinations. In other words, it didn't reduce very much at all. And I started with the hypothesis that vernacular terms for trade would indicate a cluster of particular activities. That didn't happen. And what I concluded was that firms tend to diversity in their activities, uniqueness if they can, and complexity. And why might that be? Why do firms not all do the same thing? I don't know. I've never really had a good answer to that question, but certainly what we can infer from the existence of uniqueness, diversity, and complexity in the activities of firms is that there's a kind of systemic resilience, as there might be with biodiversity in an ecosystem, that firms are not the same. Actually, existing markets are much more complicated than textbook markets, and we can't compare firms in a production function approach to efficiency. And my hypothesis to throw out to you is that these markets are much more diverse than production, that the sphere of distribution is more complicated than the sphere of production. Okay, on to costs. In the textbook, it'll be capital costs, fixed costs, and variable costs. And while Marxists might want to define them differently, we have at least to use concepts that may be intelligible to the person to whom we're talking. So a capital cost is a one-time cost, and the textbook suggests it's land and buildings, things like that. But what do you do when a machine like a rice mill, which can be quite capital intensive now, consists of parts, every single one of which can be replaced? So the capital cost then is the sum of variable costs. These are questions that we have to bear in mind. Fixed costs don't vary with output. They're things like rent and permanent salaries, interest, depreciation, and possibly some fixed taxes and fees for utilities. But we cannot assume any of this is fixed in the informal market economy. So tax may be a no-go, it may be widely evaded, and if you raise that matter, you end the interview effectively. And many other fixed costs may well be actually variable. Variable costs vary with turnover, things like fuel and energy, lube, raw materials, transport, casual labor, equipment, and all the repairs. And again, we can't assume. We have to know something about the sector we're studying and need to think about transactions costs and need to think about what they might be in practice, which is, again, an empirical question. The costs of belonging to an association, because for many businessmen, collective activity is a precondition for competitive activity. And association costs will include collective bribes for lobbying to avoid regulative policy. We have to include the costs of byproducts. We may have to include, at least ask about the costs of waste and its disposal. We certainly need to include transport. Who pays for transport? Transport can't be assumed to be a distance coefficient, as in a regression model. It's a derived market with its own technologies, organizations, and prices. Then let's look at labor. Labor is not equal. Labor is not substitutable. In the Indian rural and regional economy, there's a hierarchy of precarity and security and deference. We can stylize it as regular and casual and family. Under regular, we might imagine it will be the engineers, it will be the accountant, it will be the managers, but it is also the sweepers, not necessarily the skilled labor force. It's more to do with loyalty, and pay will vary with age and loyalty. Pay and perquisites are shaped by loyalty as much as by skill and qualification. Casual labor is exactly the opposite. There are no records of casual labor. Often a businessman doesn't know how much casual labor, not because they don't know, but because it varies so much. And the crude question of an outsider is one they can't answer very easily. It'll be gendered. Even the casual labor will have a variety of contracts and a variety of rates. It won't be organized. Child labor and apprentices may just be invisible, like female family labor. And you really have to prod. And in the case of child labor, of course, you will get a widespread denial that it exists. Then we have family labor, and we have patriarchy in its oldest sense, the male control of men. And the question for the economists is, what are the costs of family labor? It's often referred to as pocket money or living expenses. How do we cost the education of family labor and the reproduction costs of family labor? Very difficult. In a multi-purpose enterprise, attributing the consumption costs of family labor to one element of a portfolio will exaggerate them and artificially lower the rate of return to the firm that we're trying to study. And what on earth do we do about partnerships? Do we make separate accounts for each of the partners? It's the same problem as with female family labor who are completely invisible, except for the huge cost of dowry. How on earth do we integrate dowry into the costs of a firm when we're trying to examine costs and returns from the perspective of efficiency? So we can conclude that the costs of production of a firm and reproduction costs are an empirical question and a problem of concept, which is a problem which is hard for us to figure out and also incomprehensible for a businessman to figure out for our benefit. Then credit. Most businessmen are involved in webs and hierarchies of credit. Isabelle Guérin has called it juggling. We might ask, is gold part of capital or is it money? We might ask, when is delayed payment on a transaction actually a debt? Most firms have multiple loans at varying terms of conditions using different kinds of collateral. And it's easy for an economist to say these markets are fragmented, but how are they fragmented? And are they in fact structured through customary norms for attributes like interest, which vary with gender, with caste, with location, with class, and with the existence or not of physical enforcers? How on earth do we aggregate the unaggregatable when our respondent has no idea how many loans they have and under what terms and conditions? Well, one way is to collapse it into seasonal profiles and not forget episodes of disaster with credit. But it's a really difficult question, how to collapse the extraordinary complexity of credit relations into a cost in concept of cost of production. On raw materials, all I want to say is that a capitalist will maximize the cost of the raw materials and minimize the gross output in order to minimize what appears to the interviewer to be their profit. So what do we do? There are many angles through which to estimate the cost of raw materials, the quantity of raw materials. One is a direct question, and they might answer it to the best of their ability. But again, many businessmen don't actually know the answer. One way of getting at it is through history. When you started, how much was your turnover in quantity terms? How has it changed over the years? Another way is to get seasonal profiles. We might ask in physical terms and then ask about a representative price, but prices are very volatile, and that again produces an estimate. Or we might extrapolate indirectly from labor or from data on SACs or particular kinds of maintenance that prove to be quite accurately correlated with raw material costs. Now, turning to prices, this is really a different world from the econometrics data that we read about in journals. The late Ben Crow did a marvelous study of rice marketing in Bangladesh, and about halfway through that book, there's a diagram of the price dispersions in one market on one day. And he attributes the enormous range of prices in one market on one day. And just remember that for most data, for most statistical purposes, we'll be using monthly data or weekly data, and certainly not this level of granularity. He attributes that to asymmetric bargaining power and makes a very strong statement about prices as reflective of social relations. And we might compare that attitude to price to Jean-Philippe Plateau's famous 1993 paper in the Journal of Development Studies, when he argued that generalized morality is necessary for price formation. Okay, so what is generalized morality? My experience in the field suggests that there are many kinds of morality which are relevant to price formation. One is that of accumulation and profit. That's the most obvious one. And it's expressed through interlocked contracts, through buying as cheap as you can and selling as dear as you can, through asymmetry in payment. In other words, you pay me quickly, but I pay you very slowly, and you have to have more working capital as a result. And just basic cruelty through third-party sanctions, through threats of third-party sanctions if you don't accept a price, or through the existence of private militias, which are a lot more widespread than an office-based economist might imagine. But there's also the morality of autonomy, which leads to self-exploitation and perhaps to accepting lower prices than might be accepted in competitive conditions, maximizing production rather than maximizing profit, and considering the purity of that independence and autonomy a matter of pride rather than maximizing profit. Then there's a variety of satisficing motives with target income or optimizing in a secure place, for instance, in a global value chain, a nice secure niche. There might be morality based on responsibility to others and collegiality, especially to kin, investing in kin, making exchanges on the basis of reciprocity rather than absolute price maximization. if I'm engaged in quite reliable, repetitive, relational trading, I might also not be maximizing profit in the way in which I agree to prices. And in the end, there's a plurality of customary norms of the parties to the exchange based on caste and gender, religion, tribe, and so on and so forth. So prices are not necessarily sweet, as in sweet commerce, and may be formed in a variety of ways. K.N. Chaudhry reminded us of the importance of space in price formation. And he models three kinds of price formation, one which is local, one which is regional and wholesale, and one which is a futures wholesale market. So these price bases may be different, and they may also vary with the season. So then we might have price on the basis of costs plus, or a regional price base, or yesterday's price, or the prices of byproducts entering the prices that you will accept for the main product, or in some cases, the threat of the scope of the public distribution system in seasonal competition. So finally, we have a body of literature that shows, even if we can't tell it through fieldwork, that quality characters affect price. Moisture, evenness, the color, the smell of the commodity, the cultural meaning of the commodity, the adulteration, all can be shown to affect prices. I've elsewhere called that quiddity. It's an old-fashioned word which means the thinginess of the commodity, and the thinginess, the physical characteristics, and also the social meaning affect its price. So what do we conclude? We conclude that prices are formed through many kinds of economic and social relations. Following that, all I want to say about contracts are that as economists, we kind of think of them as enforceable agreements. But enforceable agreements, written contracts, are quite unusual. Perhaps they're now becoming less unusual than they were in the recent past. But still, over quite a lot of the economy, they are verbal. And the contract is actually a way of competing to find ways of avoiding competition and avoiding surveillance. Right, on to profit. Is profit a category mistake? Why might it be a category mistake? Well, it might be a conceptual non-starter because of the problem of the indissolvability of the residual claim. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? I mean that a businessman finds it very difficult, if they're a small businessman, to distinguish between profit and consumption, because the family is the unit of production, the family is the unit of consumption. So can we estimate consumption? If we overestimate consumption of the family, we need demographic data and basic data on the family budget, which we can use to impute consumption. But if we overestimate it, we overestimate the profit of big firms, because in the real world, sorry, I'll say that again. When we estimate consumption, we may overestimate profit of big firms, because in the real world, consumption is income elastic, and we don't know the precise consumption basket of a big business family's expenditure. And it could lead to the underestimation of profit when a firm is actually part of a family portfolio of a variety of firms. So there are many forms of realization of profit. Often revenue minus costs is estimated as a proportion of working capital. It should actually be total capital, but even the businessman doesn't know the value of his or her total capital. So we might ask for local averages of a capital stock for land and building and machinery, but these are all gross categories, and the average money that they have for buying and selling if we want to estimate working capital. But these things are actually very difficult for our respondents to estimate, let alone us. And then time matters. It matters because rates of return may vary seasonally. Joint families may shift resources between firms seasonally. So there are variations between the elements in a joint family portfolio, between the seasons and places and resources shifted between various activities. So what on earth do we conclude? We conclude that there's a paradox of uneven rates of return within a system of markets. There are lower rates of return for more productive activity. And there's a negative correlation, which is quite a robust result for rates of return and numbers of activity. The greater your complexity and diversity of activity, the lower your rates of return. So that functional complexity is not necessarily an indicator of higher rates of return. This is, of course, a completely different argument from the argument of the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. I won't go there, but I'm not talking about that. And we end up with the need for profit, but not being able to have profit. So we need to be able to compare sectors within the rural economy, but we can't do this rigorously. So what about accumulation in portfolios? Again, there's the question of consumption or investment when labor is both a factor of consumption and also an investment. It's again a category error. What we find when we ask about investment portfolios is that they are very diverse, and increasingly, even in agricultural markets, they're unhitched from the origin of capital in rent or in profit. There's a very interesting question, which I don't think has been addressed, about the barriers to investment in non-agricultural activities, industrial activities. So agricultural capitalists will be traders, they will invest in lorries, in transport, in mills and coal stores and stores, in processing, in real estate, in construction, and finally in finance, and then latterly in the education of their family, their sons and their daughters. And an example from West Bengal in my book on rural commercial capital 2008 was somebody who started in paddy trade, then went into paddy and rice, and then made a huge jump, which is extremely unusual, into the distribution, a wholesale distribution of iron and steel products. And then the rest of his portfolio is quite typical: property, finance, and textiles. So one tends to get those kinds of business portfolios as firms concentrate and accumulate. In other words, they diversify. They diversify in diverse ways. Now, when we talk about accumulation, we mustn't forget losses. One mustn't forget bankruptcies. And you'll see why towards the end of my talk, when I'm looking at what anthropologists and historians contribute to all this. Of course, we know that failures are not around. We can't find them because they're not there. But we can learn about losses through past histories and also through asking third-party kind of questions like, what kind of losses have been made in this sector or in this town or in this region? And what we find is that business is quite risky. And there are many kinds of sources of disaster: price volatility, delays and defaults on payment, sickness or the death of a partner, rain and fire, weather events, labor strikes, adulteration, rotting in storage, technical problems with generators and cooling machines, and finally, common garden theft. And what do we learn from that? That business is not, even when rates of return are quite high, higher than in agriculture, for instance, business is risky, but firms go bankrupt and then they reform. They rise from the ashes. So to conclude the first part of the talk on the economics of efficiency and what we learned from fieldwork, I think you can see that efficiency is a holy grail. It's something that we seek eagerly, but we cannot find. And that there's obviously a tension between the general and the specific, between the concepts of academics and the concepts of practitioners in the field. And even in 21st century India, after Snyder and Hay, the concept of efficiency is cultural product without a firm basis in local culture. That concept is a cultural product without a firm basis in local culture. And we can probably ask the same kind of question of macroeconomic concepts and models as well. So the problem of efficiency, we find, is one of imposing bureaucratic or disciplinary categories and norms onto actually existing markets. Isabelle Garin has gone so far as to call them arbitrary conventions of our economics discipline. But we do find that markets misbehave even in their own terms. Are they too complex? We have a whole host of adjectives to cover the complexity: black, grey, informal, unorganized, as markets, as sectors, and as capitalism. Is that complexity simply confined to markets as economic phenomena? Do we actually fetishize markets? This is one of the questions that has energized part 2 of my talk and was the basis of the book Rethinking Markets in Modern India, which came out last year. And this is a book in which modern markets are described by anthropologists and also historians. And the answer to the question whether we fetishize markets as economic phenomena, they give as a yes. We need to humanize them. They are over-fetishized by economists. So I want to finish by talking about the lessons from the book, the lessons from the field work and the archival work that is done by non-economists on the social character of markets. Pure economic markets don't exist. For Polanyi, they can't exist. They must not exist. They're a contradiction in terms. However, if markets are increasingly generalized, as economists are assuming, and if market exchange is increasingly disembedded from the Polanyi's other forms of distribution and reciprocity, if market exchange is becoming more and more important, is that very process of disembedding a set of social relations. If this is a strange question, think about the supermarket. The supermarket is a global institution, but a British one, American one, French one, Indian one, all these different supermarkets have their own commodity characters. And the character of commodities fill the business pages of the financial press. So how to understand the social character of capitalism and capitalist institutions? For Marx, the social character was derived from animal spirits, from Weber, the steel cage, from Polanyi, disembedded exchange. But none of these processes have happened completely. What we have to accept, and I know that some scholars of India do not accept this, what I think we have to accept is that social, cultural, and political institutions and practices are completely modern. They are not non-capitalist and they are not pre-capitalist. Markets are suffused with different kinds of authority and power and sometimes force. If you find that hard to imagine, think about the power of patriarchy and then the power of reputation. They are different kinds of authority, different kinds of power. They are differentiated. Think about the social meaning of default for a small farmer versus default for Mr. Adani. So what we might develop is the idea that a set of institutions are not just a social structure of accumulation. They're also a social structure of discrimination within the economy and also contested outside the economy, so that we have social structures, kinds of crucibles within which economic activity takes place, which are in conflict, some of which may persist, some of which are destroyed, new ones are created, many are reworked to serve the interests of capital. There's a big literature on gender, and there's a big literature on caste, excuse me. So the first aspect of the social characteristics of markets and capitalism is their embeddedness in social institutions. The second aspect I want to speak to is the idea of the plurality of logics and of knowledges and of epistemes practiced through market institutions. In our book, Rethinking Markets, there are whole chapters on occult forces in markets, on astrology, the role of astrology in making decisions in markets. Kinship, I've already covered, the role of affect, of emotion, of psychological effects, of risk-taking aptitudes, of intuition. And lastly, but not least, of lack of choice and of the need for dignity and the oppressive nature of lack of dignity in a market exchange. The question that arises, are there limits to calculative reasoning? Well, we know that information, contacts, credit, transport are never complete, despite Mr. Adani's infrastructure project. How do we distinguish these things in the field? I think it's extremely hard. However, I think it's useful to think analytically about the idea that a plurality of logics are braided in market exchange. But it does give rise to very thorny questions, the answers to which I certainly don't have, which is that these logics are not chaotic, that there must be a social consensus about their terrain, their territory, their scope. And for me, there's a big question about how that a social consensus about the operation of a plurality of knowledge inside market exchange, how that consensus develops. I don't know the answer to that question. How does regulative law, how do legal institutions, how do guilds operate, how do collective action, which, as I said before, is a necessary precondition often to competition, as well as a way to bend the implementation of state policies. How do all of these things come to develop? How are they reproduced? I don't know the answer. I just feel that Frieder Otto Wolf's scoping of institutions of social reproduction, which were not confined to market regulations, certainly not, or to within the family and gender, which is how we normally understand them, but included things like schools and colleges and the police. How do they come to support markets, and how are they reproduced and regulated as economic phenomena and as institutions which shape economic phenomena? The last point that I want to make in this talk is about regulative context, and the point that the book makes, Rethinking Markets, through work done by anthropologists and historians, is that there's an enormous variety of social authority and social institutions, but we must not discard the state. Even in the informal economy, the non-state regulated economy, the state is actually involved in shaping and creating non-state regulated markets. And a large number of questions arise from the fact that we can derive informal markets from state regulations designed to formalize markets. Are these markets, which exist because of state regulation but are not regulated by the state, are they undesirable from the state's purview? Probably they're undesirable if it means that the state is losing tax, if it means that the state is unable to watch the market, to observe the market, and if there are oppressive social side effects of this paradoxical creation of informal markets through state regulation. Does it mean simply that these informal markets are residual and that they express the limits of state regulative capacity? This is what I certainly used to think. But since I read the work of Karana on labor legislation in the 1940s and 50s, I came to understand that state creation of informal markets is quite deliberate, and it's a result of a politics of pacifying capital, which is hostile to regulation. When we think of labor, it is only the largest firms which come under the Factories Act. I think 95% of Indian firms don't come under the Factories Act and the labor legislation because they're too small. They have under 5 employees. So we find the actually existing state colluding with the actually existing non-state regulative institutions. And again, people are groping for concepts and terms to describe what we find. The word hybrid is used, the word parastate is used in the literature, the concept of an assemblage, which is a constellation of concepts and entities which we normally examine as separate, like state, market, and civil society, all mashed up together. And Lucia Micheluti has used a wonderful Italian term, intreccio, which means entanglement for the criminal economy, as it's entangled with the actually existing state. Asim Prakash has called it a political space. What I want to conclude from that is that much more is needed to be known about the capacity of the state to regulate. Okay, final questions. I started out with efficiency, but I don't think that I end with efficiency, even if I would like to end with efficiency. It's a holy grail. It's an object of eager searching, but for the reasons that I've tried to explain this evening, it's exceedingly difficult to find. Given the paramountcy of markets as economic phenomenon through which capitalism is constituted, we have a very big problem. How do we understand the relationship between the logic of capital, accumulate, 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 that is Moses and the prophets, or profit maximization in markets, if you have another theoretical framework, the logic of competition, the logic of modification on the one hand, and all the particularities of the practice of market exchange as it happens in India on the other. And the last question I want to pose to you is that is the study of the economy without society simply incomplete? Is society just an add-on, or is it actually wrong because society is constitutive of the economy, and vice versa? Is studying markets as social phenomena, as the anthropologists and historians do in our book, without any economic information or any respect for the market as an economic phenomenon? After all, if you can't cover costs, you tend to go bankrupt. Is that incomplete, or is it wrong? And how do we test or refute either of those questions if we reformulate them as hypotheses? Clearly, more fieldwork is needed, and I wish some of you the courage to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thanks a lot for this wonderful discussion. Actually, it was reminding me a lot of my own little field work. So thank you for reminding all of us about this. So now I will open the session for Q&A. Anyone has question, please raise your hand. If nobody's raising hand first, I will take the privilege of asking the first question, but let's wait for 30 seconds to see if somebody wants to. Sometimes it takes time to initiate the Q&A. Okay, I will ask the first question then. The first thing is that I can relate what you just said, the complexities of the ground, how social relationship and the plurality in it actually complicating categorization, any kind of categorization, if you want to make. We can definitely try to narrate this process, but conventional economics will always encourage us to put it in numbers. I'm not asking for a written on a stone answer, but how we deal with that, because when we narrate this, they will ask categorize. And then everything goes out of control. I mean, like I was dealing with land values, and I was chatting with a small poultry shop which sells chicken in Bengal every corner. And I used to talk with them for months, and then I used to ask how you determine today's 180 rupees, and yesterday it was 160 rupees. How do you determine that price? And actually, the person couldn't give me a proper answer. We debated a lot of time, cost of production and whatnot. And they know this kind of term, not the technical cost of production, but they talk about the price of fertilities, etc., etc. And I used to joke with them, oh, yesterday it was 50 rupees and today it was 60 rupees, right? So you're buying every day your fertilizer, and that's how you're calculating your cost. So how to deal with that, this complexity?
Okay. I've got 3 ways of answering that question, and I don't think that exhausts the answer to this question. One is, your example was a case in point, that the person you're talking to doesn't know the answer. Yes? And that's quite common. It's not that they're trying to evade, they actually don't know. They're not calculating in terms of years from December to January or whatever. So what I do, and I don't know whether this is good, bad, or indifferent, is I try to go at the question through a number of ways. And mostly the answers converge. So the data is always an approximation, it's an estimation, right? So as I explained with gross output, it can be done by direct question, which, as you say, they can't answer, not because they're trying to evade, they don't know the answer. It can be done with seasonal profiles. It could be done busy day, slack day. How many days are busy, how many days are slack? Yes. It can be done through labor costs or through the cost of a key indicator like gunny bags. Yes. Or it can be done historically. Actually, I find that asking them to tell their life stories is a very good way of making it easier to ask questions about the present. So that's one answer. Answer number 2 is to the question about economics needing numbers, is that quite a lot of what we're asking is about processes. Yes, and processes don't always need numbers. They need detailed examples, convincing examples. And even when economists are building models, if they're trying to explain, they're often having to use different forms of knowledge in order to explain the results of an econometric exercise. But the third kind of answer to your question is about numbers and samples and how we come to know. And that is a very thorny question. As I showed in the second slide, actually I didn't explain that slide, but on the left was a very complicated diagram of a marketing system, which was learned about through hanging around, taking a random sample, a stratified random sample from a consolidated list from a variety of official sources. But when that doesn't exist, which it often doesn't, we have to use transepts, we have to use snowballs. But if we do that, we have to be very careful about generalizing. And I think numbers are something to be treated with caution. The temptation is to build models, to use regression analysis and so on and so forth. And in the end, sometimes you end up with the right answer to the right question at the end of a very long process of fieldwork. So you can't use regression analysis, or more often you use a combination of methods, Q2, some qualitative, some quantitative. In other words, there's no answer to this question. However, the people who are sitting in offices dealing with big data, they should ask themselves the question, how was that data got? Yes, because in the end, it's the result of the sort of process that I've tried to describe this evening.
Yeah, because you see, as an ethnographer or doing qualitative interviews, I can spend hours and hours, days and days talking to one chicken seller and try to get as much accurate data as possible. But for NSSO data or any large scale data, the person is going and spending half an hour, 40 minutes, okay, 1 hour max for 350 rupees or some rupees per. That is the auction price for L1, you know, the lowest bidder gets the chance to collect the data. And so that kind of data, we are, you know, doing all sorts of calculation and producing a number. So that's the scary picture. But okay, I have used my privileges. Any more question? This is a wonderful day and nobody wants to ask any question. Anyone? Arun, maybe you have to use your privilege, otherwise.
I mean, I was particularly stricken by the last aspect of this plurality of logic in the market exchange that you were mentioning about. In our own group, we have been always talking about why economists should aspire or should take into their form about pluralism, and how economics has always gone down to homogenizing situations. And so I'm really taking things, the ideas are settling in my mind. But maybe taking a step back as social scientist, and the need, maybe you can just comment on what is the need for us to really take plurality into our day-to-day social science experiments, not experiments, social science activities. So that would be very interesting to hear in your words. How do you see plurality as the intersection of economics and in social science in general?
It's an easy question to ask and a difficult question to answer. And it's really the question I was posing at the end. Is it incomplete or is it wrong? So I think we should assume it's wrong, that social relations are constitutive of the economy, that culture matters, and then we can refute it if we take that approach, a hypothesis testing approach, that gender matters. Now prove me wrong. That caste matters. Prove me wrong. Right? And why is that important? That's important for unraveling paradoxes of policy, where intended beneficiaries become victims and vice versa, where all kinds of unintended outcomes happen to policy, which is a regular occurrence, and not just in India, everywhere. We, as social scientists, we're irresponsible when we make policy, when policy is an implication, which we haven't studied. Yeah, it's a residual at the end of our regression analysis, right? Policy is actually a living thing. It's the state and the state bureaucracy and its relation with civil society and markets is a dynamic set of institutions. And unless we understand that, we won't understand the costs, the true costs of policy, or we won't understand many of the untheorized evil side effects of market exchange. Market exchange is regarded by economists as a good thing. If it's so good, well, Amartya Sen said in a 1990 article, market exchange is actually consistent with any distribution of income, including parts of the distribution where people have no income at all. Yes, it's not the job of markets to solve that problem. And we need to know who are the people who suffer from markets, for whom markets are destructive. Yes, not simply opportunities that they can invest in a voluntarist, speculative way, but who are the people for whom market exchange is compulsive, oppressive, right? So that's how I would go about answering your question, but there may be other answers, and there may be other people here who have other answers, and I would love to hear them.
And this is particularly true when we consider developing countries or South, global South countries, when this plurality. But yeah, so that's a very general question.
Actually, I would like to add that I think that that's completely modern. That we have to think of Indian capitalism with festooned in social institutions as a completely modern form of capitalism. Yes, not as archaic, antediluvian, no, because that brings with it the idea that it will go away. And there's no evidence that these things disappear. There's a lot of evidence for the reworking of social institutions to serve the interests of capital.
Okay, who wants to ask next? Nobody? Oh no, it's shame. Suresh, now I'm being bullied. I know, Suresh, we are organizing something else together. This is embarrassing. Okay, if really, okay, please.
Hello, hello. Yeah, I joined late, sorry. I joined late, but I just wanted to make a comment regarding the question. because, yeah, I think another approach to address the issue of plurality in economics is the notion of past dependence. If we take it seriously, then we see science, societies and economies as singularities. Then economics becomes the science of singularities. Then you invent methods, approaches, and concepts as you go. You don't just take out of shelf set of methods or concepts or approaches or theories to address the issues on the ground in India or in any other places. You get a kind of theory called grounded theory. You start from the ground, but you take all of the experiences and theories and all of your education, but you have the openness and the readiness to create concepts and theories and test this all the time and go forth and back between the experiences and data and theories. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that comment, Fahad. I also think path dependence is extremely important. And I wonder whether I could put it a slightly different way, that the tendency in economics is to consider space, for instance, in terms of a distance coefficient or a transport coefficient in a regression approach to explanation, and time fixed in the same way, and society perhaps treated as dummies in a complicated regression analysis. And in other disciplines, space is special. We can't substitute one space for another space. In old-fashioned geography, there was regional geography. It's almost completely stopped being taught all over the world. But regional geography was inspired by an intuition, which I think is really important, which is that space is specific, that space has character and that is not substitutable. And the same thing is true with history and time, that for historians, time is special. It can't be repeated, or if it can, it's unusual. And again, for many, fundamental to anthropology and for many sociologists, society is specific. So we have a clash, an epistemological clash between economics and other disciplines. And what's interesting to me is the colonization of other disciplines by economics and what that does to their unique approaches to these very important non-economic factors, which you've reminded us of. Shortly in Modern Asian Studies, there'll be a set of reviews of this book, Rethinking Markets. And two of the reviewers are economists, Ali Jan and Isabelle Guérin. And Isabelle Guérin has really, although she's a good economist and she does econometrics and modeling, she is very aware of the system as being a construct, a social construct. And I hope that's one of the messages from my talk, that efficiency is a social construct and trying to find it in reality is incredibly difficult. And macroeconomic models are social constructs, and commutable general equilibrium models have to be, in some sense, closed when we're dealing with open systems. We're constantly having to impose an order, which is not necessarily that of the real world, in order to understand the real world better. And that's yet another paradox that we're faced with as researchers. Thank you very much for making those comments.
Okay, any more questions? Otherwise, we have taken our allotted time. I would be happy to close it, but I'm also happy to accommodate one or two questions. One thing, Barbara, about this, morality. I mean, we are often also very flexible. For example, in India, I mean, for example, yeah, caste matters, religion, identity matters. And based on those things, we often, business fight, rivalry goes on.
Yeah.
But then we are also flexible. I mean, for strange reason, Hindu and Muslim businessmen works together, even though they hate each other. I mean, you talk to them privately, they will say all the not so nice thing, but then they will cooperate. And I mean, God knows for what reason they will again start infighting. So this, I mean, unpredictability in human behavior complicates everything. I mean, further. I mean,
yes, it does, and we must assume this. We must search for it and celebrate it. However, for a mainstream development economist, this is below their radar. They're not interested in it. As you said, the important thing is to simplify, and already that simplification is the basis for quite complicated modeling under all kinds of assumptions. I'm not trying to diss development economics at all, but I'm simply saying, I'm asking a question whether this complexity, which we know exists even if we ignore it, even if we say it's not something we want to research, it's not going to go away in the real world. Does that complexity matter? Yes. And I suppose the next question is matter for what? And then we go round in circles because back to the question which I answered before, why bother? It's very true that caste and ethnicity define insiders and outsiders. And there was a big body of research a long time ago, maybe 70s, 80s, which showed just what a difference it made to transactions and to contractual behavior, and especially to money lending. I'm not so sure that there are the detailed studies of business these days that would enable us to compare then and now, and enable us to know whether those systems are relaxing, whether the other still exists, or how the other exists, my people and your people, inside a market economy, whether that's relevant. I examined a thesis by Denet Dinler on waste in Turkey, and she stopped her analysis at one point and introduced a chapter on the London Metal Exchange. And why did she do this? Because the prices for metal waste in Turkey were being formed in London. And the London Metal Exchange is not a disinterested, autonomously functioning economic entity. It's got its own history, and its traders are a very tightly knit group of people whose families have known each other's families for generations. And there are studies of Wall Street to this effect, that institutions we think epitomize perfectly competitive or anonymous exchange are not anonymous at all. Even if the data that results from them comes up on our laptop screens in a way which looks anonymous, there's a whole seething set of social relations behind those markets, the most globalized, most modern markets of the world. So us and others, I think, is still a relevant kind of question to ask about economic behavior. And you mentioned people behaving collectively and yet being at loggerheads individually, according to the circumstance. And so my own experience with associations, trade associations, is that they almost always were created at times of threat. And the threat almost always came from the state. I think the threat may now come from different scales of capital, corporate capital, entering the rural economy and threatening the intermediate classes and family business. But the trade associations represent collective interest. And so one can analyze those threats to the functioning of firms, which are collective threats, and those threats which are individual threats, and then start to see how people can collude together for some purposes and yet compete with one another for other purposes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think, okay, oh yes, Suresh, you can, please go ahead. Suresh now has decided to open his mouth. Yes.
Hello, ma'am. It was very nice and very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Satvik, am I audible or not?
Hello?
You are
Okay. Just
yes, we can hear you.
I just have a doubt or some queries. Like, if you see the political economy of caste in India as such, see, caste is actually like, we will see that, for example, even though if you go into a very high position also, we say that we got a Dalit president, we got a tribal president. So the caste, even though reaching the highest position in economics or economic position or so on, but we are carrying till there. So how can we eliminate the problem of caste? So I'm telling in an example because I just want to understand that the caste in India is itself is very very problematic, because we see that most of the caste, like we say that the lower caste as compared to the upper caste have less access or no access in most of the resources, most of the economic political resources, even though we are giving some reservations in politics. But so I'm working on a financial inclusion aspect, so I got so many things. So they don't have a bank account. So if you see the within the caste also, the women's are like if you take individual women as an entity, they don't have access to bank account. So how you will see these two dual scenario, ma'am? Because the problem is there, exclusion, so many suppression, all these things are there. But we, after getting the economic opportunity, political opportunity, but you are still carrying the that what is called identity.
Yeah, when I first came to India in 1969, I thought that when I was the age I am now, poverty would have been vanquished and caste would no longer exist. And it's been an incredible thing to have to admit that as with gender, so with caste, there are processes unfolding in the Indian economy which dissolve the effects of these institutions, but at the same time, there are processes unfolding which accentuate these institutions. So I think social science theorizes contradictory forces. We have class contradictions, which we understand, but a force which, like gender, which can be being dissolved at the same time as being reinforced, depending on circumstance, is difficult for social scientists to theorize, but I think that that's what's going on. So in the small town that I've studied since 1973, the business associations are grounded in caste. The textiles association are Mudalias. It doesn't mean to say that the traders are only Mudalias. They come from a range of castes, but the trader business association is grounded in a caste association, which has been transformed. But as you say, caste is a pervasive institution, as gender is. I was very influenced by Asim Prakash's Dalit Capital. I wrote the foreword to that book, and he shows comprehensively through data which is case study data. I think he interviewed 90 businessmen, Dalit businessmen in North India. So the sample is 90, but he doesn't do a quantitative analysis. He's concerned with durable and resilient processes of discrimination, and he finds them everywhere, including a different approach to the state, where upper caste businessmen may make a contact amongst the bureaucracy, and through that one contact, they will then network with other bureaucrats to gain advantage. But a Dalit businessman has to make a contact every time they need to interact with the state, which is a much more costly form of clientelism. Anyway, how to eliminate gender education, how to eliminate caste, inter-caste marriages. I find that caste is very important in the economy that I've studied for the transfer of business capital at the time of marriage and inheritance. And as long as that process goes on, I don't see caste dissolving. I think it remains in marriages, kinship, and diet in a very powerful way. And that's the cultural substrate to economic behavior, which is still exclusive. I don't think I'm saying anything that wasn't terribly well known 100 years ago.
Just a follow-up. I mean, because there are similar systems all over the world. For example, even in Germany, there is Scuba, Muller, the family names are the old, occupations. Huh?
Yeah.
Like if somebody with one something, that means, oh, he's from
Yes, he's an aristocrat.
family. Yeah.
Yes.
So similarly in Japan, a similar thing they had. The casta is Portuguese. So they had similar system. I mean, can you draw any kind of comparison? How, very briefly, I know we have overshot the time, so very briefly, if you can, please.
I think it's very, I don't know of many comparative studies, but I think it would be a very interesting thing to do, but you would have to do fieldwork in two societies to understand how it works, because caste is a particularly contaminating hierarchical institution. You might say the same for the British or the German aristocracy, that it's contaminating, but I think the concept of purity and pollution is particularly powerful in India. On the other hand, what you've observed, which is extreme social stratification, which we have in Britain too, is something which only was affected in a direction that might have dissolved it through social democracy, through a welfare state, through state opportunities. And I think it's only state action which can counteract these very, very powerful social institutions. And as my own country has been prey to neoliberalism from quite early on, what we find is that inequality is getting greater and greater, and that the stratification at the top is getting more and more fortified, reinforced, yeah? And poverty at the bottom is getting more and more pervasive and damaging to society. And we know that inequality is damaging to social cohesion. So I don't know any other solution but a powerful state. And I say that at a point in history where we don't have power. We have powerful states for certain purposes, supporting global capital, but not for addressing the kind of problem that you've raised.
Oh my goodness, this is a big question.
Manuela.
It's better you ask yourself if you want to.
Okay, yeah, I will open
Yeah.
the camera. Thank you. Thank you for the talk, was very interesting. Well, I've been doing field work in Oman, not in India, well in Oman, social field work on the impact of, well, mass tourism in a souk, in a bazaar, just opposite to the cruise liner port. And I've been studying as well the social relations and within the souk, which is very Indian dominated as well, and well, male only. So it has been, well, I've been doing my research for, yeah, in the past 10 years approximately. So developed through a PhD, and then I continued my research as well during the Corona pandemic. So I just wanted to know, and very often, well, I myself, I've been asked, how do you position yourself as a female within this male-dominated field? And I find it not so easy to respond. And as well as a female social science researcher, well, I'm a cultural geographer. Being in a business world, it has been quite challenging. So I would like to know how did you experience this, and how do you position yourself?
That's a really interesting question. and thank you for asking it. I wrote about this a very long time ago. When I started interviewing businessmen, overwhelmingly men, about 2 or 3% women, and very unusual women. I found in the literature that a lot of the literature that was, which involved fieldwork had been carried out by women rather than men. This is a big, and Mekhala Krishnamurti has concluded the same thing with her pioneering study of markets in Madhya Pradesh, that it's a female field in a very male world. One aspect of this is that a woman is less likely to be identified with the state. Yes, so it's not ethnicity, it's gender, it's not being foreign. Being foreign might be considered to be less likely to be identified with the state, but at some deep level, you've been given permission, you've been given a visa. Yes, so the state has approved. And to that extent, you might be compromised. But you're much less likely to be a bureaucrat because the Indian state is, the local Indian state anyway, is very male. And then being a woman is unusual. And many businessmen quite enjoy talking about their business to someone who's outside but knowledgeable. Almost always I was put through hoops. I was asked very testing questions at the start of the interview to find out whether I was an idiot, how much I knew about business, how much I knew about the sector. And if I jumped successfully through those hoops, then they were willing to talk. I've always had a male assistant, however. I've never worked with a woman. And I think I've never really scrutinized this, but I think walking around dirty places, marketplaces, very male spaces, with an assistant who is a man, sent signals that I was protected as well. I don't know whether that's happened to you. So what I do find, what I have found over the decades, is that men who study traders get a much rougher treatment than women who study business, that local people who study business get rougher treatment than foreigners who come in and study business. And when I've been challenged, I say, so many people come from India to Europe to learn about Europe, and so few people come in the other direction to learn about India. And that has been a satisfactory kind of answer. And I've also genuinely said that it's you who build the local economy. Yes, and very little is known about how you build the local economy. So I might say that toward the end. Because I'm not asking about the value of their portfolio, but what they're doing with their profits, how they're investing their profits. And so there are ways of casting quite sensitive questions about their hegemony, economic hegemony, which can be flattering to them and respectful to them. So I've always embodied contradictory feelings in these interviews. A lot of these guys are poorly educated until the current generation, where they've got MBAs and they look you up on the internet while you're doing the interview on their mobile phones. But in the past, they've been very intelligent people who've clawed their way up, undereducated, but with impressive intelligence. And so from that perspective, I've always respected these guys. But from the perspective of their role in class terms in the rural economy, it's a different thing altogether. I can see that they're the masters of the countryside, that they dominate production, and that their relations are often the relations that cause and perpetuate poverty. So I've always had a complicated kind of relationship with my respondents. Yeah, I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's a really good question to reflect on.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, well, I never had an assistant, or well, when I was in the souk, I did as well. I did research as well in the interior of Oman. There, I had from time to time some support, but since I've been working in the souk earlier as well while guiding, in tourism, some people knew me already as a tour guide, and I worked as a journalist as well prior to my work in the field as a researcher. So that was a plus, or that was easier. But I fully agree what you said. It's you get a different or it's different as well than being a local, and as well it's different than being a male researcher, for example. And they usually, I'm very often I was invited for some tea or and a chat, so it was very nice. Anyway, thank you. And I wanted to ask you if it's possible to receive a paper, or if you have published. I know you've published a few books as well. If there's anything that, or in a chapter, if you could share some work with us.
I haven't written this as a paper yet. This is tentative, but I did write a chapter for Alessandro's Massadri's Marks in the Field on interviewing traders, on merchants' capital and commercial capital, and there I've actually laid out my schedule, the schedule of questions that I ask in the order that I ask, or the kind of default order. Oh, the other thing is to be very, very flexible and to go with an order of, always to memorize the questions, never ever have a schedule of questions. Always know the questions you're going to ask, rehearse them exhaustively beforehand, go in the order that the businessman you're interviewing feels comfortable with. And there's a default setting of questions in that chapter, and I can send it to you. If you email me, I'll send it to you, or I'll send it to Satwik.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, so with that very encouraging note, Arun, please, you have the vote of thanks. The last word.
It is really a privilege to thank you, Professor Barbara, and on behalf of the association, the NCAS Initiative Association, I would like to thank you for your really enlightening talk. Sure, you have all benefited a lot from it. You're condensing several aspects of it and taking several substance of it back home, hopefully embedding in our own research. And we also hope that we can continue with this collaboration in the Scholars Initiative, in future also with you. So thanks a lot, Professor Barbara, for taking time to come to our platform.
Thank you all very much on my part. It's been very enjoyable and stimulating. See you again.
See you.